When you learn a new Photoshop or Lightroom editing technique, it can feel so exciting, like you've unlocked this new power-up for editing your photographs. And while these techniques do have their time and place, using them too much can feel a bit like adding junk food to your photographs. It tastes really good in the moment, but over time, it actually is making your photography worse. And it almost becomes like a crutch that you're relying on, as if your photography isn't good enough already. In this video, I'm going to be covering the most misused editing techniques and how to use them correctly. And if you feel personally called out in this video, please don't. Every single one of these mistakes comes from personal experience. So with that, let's move on to the first one, which is probably the most misused editing technique on the planet. And that is, of course, the Orton effect. The Orton effect was invented in the 1980s by this Canadian photographer, Michael Orton. He was really famous for popularizing certain photography techniques like ICM or intentional camera movement, and of course this dreamy, glowy effect, which has now become synonymous with his name. Now, if you look at any of Michael Orton's photographs, it is pretty clear to see he was not going for realistic. He was not a landscape photographer in the traditional sense. He was more so going for artistic. But the problem is that a lot of landscape photographers are using some of his techniques in their own photographs, trying to create this like still dreamy, crazy look that Michael Orton was famous for, while also sticking true to the more traditional and realistic landscape photography genre. Myself, circa 2020 included. And I truthfully thought that I was adding that certain je ne sais quoi to my photographs, but in reality, it just made them look weird. If you're gonna be adding that sort of glowy, dreamlike look to your photographs, that glow has to be coming from somewhere. If it doesn't, and that glow is just being applied across the entire image, it just looks off. It looks bizarre. If you think about it, if you were shooting with the sun to your back and everything in front of you is front lit, like a mountain and rocks and trees and whatnot, if that is glowing, what is making it glow? Why would a mountain be glowing? Why would a tree be glowing? Why would a river be glowing? It's not going to make visual sense unless that glow is coming from a light source in the image. Now, obviously, back in the 1980s, Michael Orton was not using Photoshop to create his Orton effect. He was using two exposures and combining them together on slide film. Today, however, I'm going to show you the basic process for creating his original look. So our first step is going to create a copy of our background layer. I'm going to hold down Command and hit J to create that copy. And the next step is to blur this image out, because originally he took one photo in focus and one photo intentionally out of focus and combined them together. So in this case, we have one image in focus and one image that we're going to make look like it's out of focus by applying a blur to the image. So I have my out of focus image on top. I'm going to then blur it out by going up to Filter, and then going down to blur, and then Gaussian blur. It's gonna come up with this little pop-up window, and it has a pixel radius down here. Right now it's set to 1, and we want to increase it to about the same number of megapixels that the camera you're shooting with has. So in this case, I was shooting with an A7R5, which has 60 megapixels, so I can change the radius to 60. And then I'm gonna hit OK. And the original technique for this was to simply change the opacity to 50%. So you have this kind of dreamy look where it's kind of glowy, it's kind of out of focus, but it's still in focus. And of course, though, this doesn't look great from a realism perspective. It might look good if your entire gallery was like this and this was the specific look you were going for, but that's not what I'm going for. So I'm gonna undo this. I'm going to just step back a little bit. And our process for creating a realistic Orton effect or a realistic glow to our images is somewhat similar, but we're going to do so in a much more calculated way. So for instance, I'm still going to blur this out, but before I do that, I'm going to do a couple of things. The first one is I'm going to brighten this image a little bit, because when you think about it, glowing things are usually a little bit brighter than the outside landscape or the rest of the image. So we're going to do that by going up to Image, Adjustments, and this time I'm going to go do levels. You could also do brightness, contrast, curves, whatever you want. I'm just going to do levels in this case, and I'm going to take away any blacks from this. I'm going to increase the output level to maybe say plus 20. We're removing about 20% of the blacks. And then I can take the midtones and slide it to the left to brighten up the image a little bit. So just like that. I'm also going to increase a little bit of saturation here. So I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and I'm going to say plus 30 or so, somewhere like that. And then again, I'm going to add that blur to the image. I'm going to go up to Filter, and then right down here to Gaussian Blur. This is the last thing I used. It's still at 60 for the pixel radius. And so we're good to go by hitting that. Now we have our Orton or our glow layer on top. And at this point, I'm going to create a black layer mask on top of this by holding down Alt or Option and then clicking on the Add Layer Mask button down here to mask it entirely out. And at this point, I can then use a brush to brush in the Orton effect only where we want it in the image. So I'm going to hit B for brush. I want to make sure my hardness is set to 0, and I'm going to take the flow down to, let's say, 10%. And from here, I can then just brush in little bits of that Orton glow. I can go on a little bit heavier than I actually want to, and then I can just take down the opacity afterwards. But for starters, I'm just going to go a little bit strong right around where that glow is, or right around where that sun is coming from. A little bit on the horizon over here, maybe a little bit of glow in the clouds up here. And if you want to make this a little bit more accurate, you can of course combine this technique with luminosity masking and whatnot. In this case, I'm just going to go really basic. I've added my glow to the image, and then I can take this opacity down a little bit, all the way to 0, and then just increase it until I think it looks good. Maybe somewhere around there. And then we can see before and after for more realistically and localizing that Orton glow in your image. So this next one we're going to be talking about is something I place sole blame on Adobe for, and that is processing your skies too dark. So let's say you're out shooting and you have a beautiful sky. There's lots of colors and you're super excited to go home and edit it. But when you do and you get home and you start editing, no matter how much you slide that highlight slider to the left, the sky still seems too bright. When Adobe started rolling out these AI masking selections where you could just click on select sky and it would select the entire sky in your image, it became really tempting to try and recover all of the highlights or all of the detail, all of the color from your sky by selecting the entire thing and then decreasing the exposure. And while yes, this will result in a nice sky selection where you can see more detail and you can see more color and you can see all of that information in the sky and in the clouds, the resulting problem is that you oftentimes have a mismatch where the sky and the landscape have the exact same tonal value. In almost every single real-world situation, the sky is going to be brighter than the landscape. Now here is a great example of an image where we have this beautiful sunset, but it is way too bright right now. And so the first instinct might be to go over to your masking panel and create a new mask of a select sky, and then just take that exposure down to recover a bunch of that detail. And while this certainly looks good in the sky and we can see all of that nice detail in the color, the problem happens when we have the exact same tonal value in the sky as we do the rest of the landscape. In just about every instance, the sky should be the brightest part of your image. So to fix this, it's super easy. We're just going to hold down Alt or Option, and we're going to intersect this mask with a linear gradient. Right here, I'm going to click once, and then I'm going to hold down Shift to make sure it stays horizontal. And I'm going to click and just drag down like so. And I can kind of drag it up from the top. And then I can click and kind of reposition this around somewhere like that. So we still have this nice bright horizon where it visually makes sense, but we have recovered some of that highlight detail on the top of the image so that it still has a more realistic fall off from bright to dark. And so you can see before and after where we've preserved that nice highlight right where the sun is, right on the horizon, but it doesn't look unnatural. Next up is the completely overused color combination of orange and teal. I'm pretty sure this one started in Hollywood, where for about a decade, you could not drive by a movie theater or log on to Netflix without being assaulted by all of these orange and teal movie posters. And for some reason, this leaked into the photography world, where now this orange and teal color combination is being sold by photographers in extremely overpriced presets. And from a color theory standpoint, it does make sense because orange and teal is a visually pleasing color combination. While I don't think that having one or two one-off orange and teal photographs is necessarily a bad thing, it is going to make your photographs look odd, especially if you're doing landscapes, precisely because there are zero naturally occurring landscapes where both orange and teal exist in the same area simultaneously. I shoot a ton in the Southwest, and the closest you can get to this naturally is the orange-red rock and the blue sky. And I actually do a lot of color grading on my own photographs where I do add a nice warmth or a nice orange to the highlights in my photos. But the problem comes in when you start adding that unnatural teal color into the shadows of your photographs. Now here's a photograph from Mono Lake out in California. And this is an image that I do want to add a little bit of color grading to. I want to add a little bit of warmth into the highlights within the color grading panel here in Lightroom. So I'm going to go down to our highlights, and I can go ahead and add that nice orange color grading to it. Not a whole lot, maybe just a little bit though, something like that. Of course, now it's a little bit too orange or a little bit too warm. So to counteract this, you could go over to your shadows and add in that blue or that teal color. But the problem in doing this, aside from taking away a lot of the natural color in the image, you're adding this unnatural look to the shadows, or you're just adding this weird color overlay to where you can see exactly what has happened. You can see that there is a split toning going on. So rather than using the shadow slider here, the shadows and the color grading, we're going to double click on this to reset it. A more realistic and more natural way is to use your masking panel and create a new mask with a luminance range. And we can select just the shadows of the image. We can have that all the way feathered out. We can go a little bit more in the selection. And rather than creating a color effect or a color overlay, we're from here going to adjust the color temperature and the tint to better counteract those warm colors in the image. So from here, I can just go and adjust the color temperature just like so, not a whole lot, and then maybe adjust the tint as well, add in just a touch of magenta, something like so, and then we can see the before and the after. So it is a more subtle way, but we have that nice, realistic, and nice warm color that's kind of emulating or adding to the sun, but it is nicely balanced in the shadows without having that unnatural color overlay or color effect to the image. Now, before we get to the last misused photo editing technique, here are a few runners up. Selective color. This one, I'm sure every single photographer has done at some point. It's really tempting to try this one out, but it is guaranteed to make your photos look amateur. Green landscapes with no greens. I don't know where this started or who to blame, but it is really popular for photographers to visit these beautiful green landscapes and take these incredible photos and then edit the greens completely out of the final image. This next one I am extremely guilty of, and that is plus 100 clarity. Sky replacements that don't line up with the natural lighting, overstretched mountains, and putting the Milky Way where it doesn't belong. And finally, this last one that we're talking about is misused masking or dodging and burning that does not make sense. If another photographer looks at your photographs and can tell how you edited the photo, you have gone overboard. Masking is best used when you're enhancing light that has already existed in the photograph. And if you are adding or brushing light into a photograph that wasn't there in the first place, you have to make sure that it visually makes sense compared to wherever the light source was originally. Now, if you've seen any of my other editing videos, you can probably already tell that I love dodging and burning. I do a ton of it myself. But if you start adding light and shadow in the opposite directions of wherever the sun has been, then the viewer is going to be able to tell that something is not quite right with your image. One of my photographs that I did an absolutely horrendous job on dodging and burning was actually included on the top 101 on the International Landscape Photography Awards. And whenever I see this photograph that I personally cringe at, I have to wonder, what the hell were those judges thinking? If you have made any of these editing mistakes, don't worry. So have I. It is part of the editing process. And if you'd like to further that learning process, you can join me on a photography adventure by heading over to my website, warnerwildernessphotography.com. We do trips all over the Southwest, up in Alaska, and beyond. Honestly, a huge thank you for watching this week's video. I'll see you next time.